I want to welcome you to this Soul Repair Center webinar presentation, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a new curricular focus in the Air Force Chaplaincy Education Curriculum. I'm Nancy Ramsay, Director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth, Texas. The center provides resources for religious leaders and professional caregivers who support veterans and their families and active duty personnel affected by moral injury. Our mission includes offering free monthly webinars that further that mission with a focus on topics that have been inadequately covered or not yet addressed. Within 10 days to 2 weeks, links to these webinars are then posted on our website, where you will also find ample additional materials related to moral injury. The Soul Repair Center is grateful for the support of the Shea Center on Moral Injury at Volunteers of America, which co-sponsors these webinars. This webinar will include opportunities to learn about a critically important innovation in chaplaincy education, resources for preparing chaplains to be more effective when military personnel whose identities include forms of difference treated oppressively report experiences of difficulty, if not actual violence. Our format will include initial presentations by 3 leaders at the Air Force Chaplaincy School, followed by conversations among them and me. And at about 3 p.m. Eastern, we will shift to give close attention to questions submitted in the chat. The leadership for this panel includes 3 persons at the Air Force Chaplain Corps College at Maxwell Air Force Base who will share their goals and experience. Chaplain Major Tara Dixon serves as a staff chaplain at the Air Force Chaplain Corps College located at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. In this capacity, Chaplain Dixon is responsible for assisting the Deputy Commandant in the design, development, and execution of curriculum and courses in the college. She manages and administers education course design and format, as well as development of future educational courses benefiting the Chaplain Corps. Chaplain Lieutenant Colonel Glen Harris serves as Deputy Commandant and Director of the Education Division at the Air Force Chaplain Corps College, Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. He's responsible for assisting the Commandant in the education and training of 2,200 Department of Air Force Chaplain Corps personnel, which includes 1,375 active duty reserve and Air National Guard chaplains and 760 religious affairs airmen. The goal of his mission is a well-educated and trained chaplain corps, serving 800,000 active duty, Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces worldwide. Dr. William Nicholas IV is the Curriculum and Faculty Development Director for the Air Force Chaplain Corps College and involves 8 professional continuing education courses. He began his career in the Air Force in 1976 and left the Air Force in 1982. In 1985, he returned and joined the NCO Leadership School staff. In 1990, he moved to the Hickam NCO Academy as an instructor and manager of Airman Leadership School programs. In 2005, he retired from active duty, and now he continues his career in civil service as an instructor in reserve and officer training schools, as well as leadership roles with the Community College of the Air Force. In 2020, he began his current role at the Chaplain Corps College. Our chat monitor is the Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, a retired captain in the United States Navy Chaplain Corps. He now serves as Director of Development at Brite Divinity School. Kyle is a founding member of the Soul Repair Center's National Advisory Board. Kyle will forward to me the questions you submit in the chat. I will be aware of those when I join the presenters around 2:45 Eastern, and I'll begin to share those questions with the presenters at the top of the next hour. We also deeply appreciate the production expertise of Sam McAllister at Volunteers of America. He will send us the link of this webinar in about 10 days to 2 weeks, and we'll post it at the tab marked Previous Webinars on our website. Now let's turn to our program.
Well, Nancy, thanks so much for the intro and the warm welcome. I'm Chaplain Harris. She introduced me earlier. I'm the Deputy Commandant here at the Air Force Chaplain Corps College. I'll just say up front that we are humbled and we are honored to be able to share a little bit of the story of our organization and our journey in exploring for our students diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. We don't consider ourselves to be experts in this field. We're pilgrims along the way, learning how to create cultures and climates of dignity and respect as we collaborate and as we serve airmen, guardians, and their families. So I would like to start by just giving our viewers a little bit of an overview of how this process has looked in the Air Force culture. If we roll the tape back to 2020 and following the murder of George Floyd, as the American cultural outcry was great, we saw that mirrored in the Air Force as well. And so our two senior most leaders at the time, our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, who is General Dave Goldfein, and our Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Chief Master Sergeant Khalith Wright, they were issuing some videos that called for an Air Force-wide stand down. And the purpose of this stand down was to have difficult conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, certainly around the topic of race, but really anywhere where a point of diversity could create stresses, strains, tensions on our organizations. So as these stand downs were occurring all across the Air Force, the Chaplain Corps had a unique part to play in that, really along two lines. The first line was internally, because in many chapel staffs at various installations all around the world, Air Force installations, these conversations were happening, knowing that our teams are not immune to these kinds of issues. And this tragic event of the murder of George Floyd and the leadership, the direction from our strategic leadership fostered these conversations that we were having internally. It was unearthing things that were previously hidden and exposing things that perhaps the teams were unaware of, or some people on the teams weren't aware of. So there was an internal dynamic to this, but also as the Chaplain Corps teams went out into the units, we were one helping agency that was helping facilitate these conversations in all the various back shops and maintenance areas and security forces, flights, and just countless number of operational units where these conversations were being had. The Chaplain Corps was there to help leadership facilitate these. Now, in the Air Force culture, we're not the main point of contact for issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Air Force has what we call an equal opportunity office that spearheads that, but we have a vested interest in creating healthy climates. And so often we're brought alongside other helping agencies to facilitate these kind of conversations. So as that was rolling out, our chief of chaplains at the time, Chaplain Steve Scheich, he wanted an internal review to look at some of the dynamics in the Chaplain Corps about how specifically people of color progressed or didn't progress. What was their experience of discrimination? And so there was a working group that was formed, and there was a data call, a survey that went out across the Chaplain Corps trying to solicit people's experiences. And as we here at the college reviewed the findings of that working group, it was alarming and it was concerning, because it told us that that various people had different experiences throughout their professional development, personal life in the Chaplain Corps. And when you add to that an external review that was done of the way that chaplains may not have certain opportunities for career advancement, promotion, selection for competitive schools, what we call a barrier analysis working group. The results of that barrier analysis working group told our Chaplain Corps leadership that there were some things we needed to get after across the Chaplain Corps to continue to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So here at the Chaplain Corps College, we're not responsible for all of that, but we knew we had a key part to play because we're the Air Force Chaplain Corps' only schoolhouse. Chaplains and religious affairs airmen come through our building multiple times throughout their career. And so we knew if the Chaplain Corps was going to be a change agent in the Air Force, then we were going to be a change agent in the Chaplain Corps. And so as we started to get our heads together as a faculty, we were blessed to have some expertise, some of which you'll hear from today, Chaplain Dixon and Dr. Nicholas. We had some people with some background and experience and education and a passion to materialize conversations and education about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm going to hand the floor over now to Chaplain Dixon to tell you a little bit about how we got this from an idea phase into something tangible that we're teaching across various classes. So Chaplain Tara Dixon, I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you, Chaplain Harris, and thank you for the invitation for us to be here with you today. I want to talk a little bit about, as Chaplain Harris mentioned, about how it all started. Basically in 2020, DAF did a racial diversity review, and then later in 2021, they came back and did one that was more specific to gender and other racial identities other than African Americans. And then the TREAT, which is called the Racial Equality Assessment Team, was the Chaplain Corps' specific review to make sure that we were doing things well. As a result of that, we, from the basic Chaplain Corps course perspective, thought about doing some things that may enhance or enable our ability to talk about the various disparities across the board. So we implemented some specific courses. One, for example, was Leading with Character and Respect, where we specifically talked about the importance of respecting every person regardless of who they are. Specifically because as Air Force chaplains, we serve all people. And so that particular lesson block allowed us to kind of have the tough conversations. But in conjunction with that, we specifically started doing offsites where we took the students downtown Montgomery to the Equal Justice Initiative, which is EJI. We also utilized the Rosa Parks Museum, and we were able to have some specific conversations around this at that level or in that capacity. Some of the things that we found were that students, of course, have their own worldview. Most chaplains, when they're brand new in the Air Force, they come from very specific denominational backgrounds and practices. If you are familiar with religion at all, you know that Sundays are the most segregated days of the week. And specifically, you engage with people who believe like you, think like you, etc. And so we bring them into the Air Force Chaplain Corps to specifically teach them how to operate and provide care, spiritual care and religious guidance and advisement to a pluralistic environment where people may have a specific faith preference or none at all. So some of the things that we found when we took them downtown to EJI is that some of the students struggled to believe that some of the data-rich artifacts that were researched and developed into the curriculum per se at EJI, they struggled to believe it was true. Some of the students thought that some of that information was fabricated. So that's some of the challenges that we kind of experienced in the offset. Some of the students of color felt like taking them downtown to EJI and not really having deep conversations around what it means or what that experience unfolded or what it means to certain groups of people was kind of performative. So we had to figure out ways that we would balance it so that we could provide what was necessary for all students. Considering that the Chaplain Corps College is a student-centered environment. So that was some of the stuff that happened in the beginning. So as a result of those BCC experiences, the Chaplain Corps College was able to send a couple of faculty members to Arbinger to be trained in outward inclusion, where we specifically talked about a variety of different biases, whether it was gender or sexual orientation or different things like that, to specifically understand how do we get after all groups of people. We also implemented panels where we had very diverse religious panels where we had chaplains who identified with LGBTQIA. We had African-American chaplains, we had Jewish chaplain, we also had Muslim chaplains, and they were able to have conversations with the students based on their own experiences. Some of the students found some of the panelists' comments to be very projecting, I would say, for lack of a better word. They felt that the panelists were directing their comments about their experiences towards them. So those are the kind of like learning dynamics that we experienced initially. And so I'll pause for a minute and turn it over to Dr. Nick and let him talk about some of the educational processes and the curriculum dynamics moving forward.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Chaplain Dixon and Dr. Ramsay, Chaplain Harris. It's truly an honor to be here with you and talk about how we actually got this implemented in our curriculum. And as Chaplain Chaplain Dixon mentioned, you know, we try to be student-centered in all of our curriculum. And so the process that we use in all of our courses follows an instructional systems design model, or ISD. And so the one that we typically use is a model called ADDIE, ADDIE, which really means analyze, design, develop, implement, and then evaluate, which is ongoing. And so one of the big questions that we had, and one of the challenges that we had, was how do we implement this topic of diversity, equity, inclusion into our courses in a way that it's student-centered, but also create a safe environment that students will feel free to talk. And so as part of the analysis phase, we looked across the a chaplain and religious affairs airman's career path. And we decided we wanted to meet the students where they are when they come to the courses. And so we did a tiered approach. And by tiered, what we did was we looked at the Arbinger material on DE&I called outward inclusion. And we were able to parcel it out in a way that it's a developmental approach so that the students, when they come to the different levels of courses in their career here, they get a new part of the information, so it's not repetitive. And it's targeted in a way that will best suit the students where they are in their career. So one of the sayings that we have in all of our curriculum is the right curriculum for the right student at the right time in their career. And so when you go through the ISD model, you just have to sit down and analyze and go through and decide, answer those questions in a way that we can make itself our student-centered, but also challenge the students to think, outside of the norm, outside of the box on this topic. And so we've implemented it in a couple of levels, and we've been getting really, really good feedback so far. And it is kind of a sensitive topic, for some people, but we create that safe environment where they feel free to discuss. And so what we wanted to do also was not have a bunch of PowerPoint slides in our curriculum. And so we make it student activity centered, where the students will get a little bit of information, we'll challenge them with questions, we'll put them in a little buzz group so they can discuss it, and then they brief it back to the class. And so everybody gets to learn from each other. It's a very dynamic environment. And so with that, one of the other questions that we had to answer is, well, how do we assess this? How do we make sure that we're on target and reaching those goals? And so what we've implemented there, and this is also with all the rest of our courses, is we use Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation and assessment. And so we actually let the students, at the end of the course, as most schools do, students have a chance to give feedback to us, but they also can provide feedback anytime during any class, any time of the day. But we do assess them at the end to see, what they gathered. That's typically level 1, level 2 reaction and learning from Kirkpatrick. And so we gather that information. The faculty also does an informal assessment, as they're integrating the material with the students and discussions and activities. The faculty is making their assessment on how well the students are engaged and if they're getting the material. At the end of each of our courses, we'll sit down and gather all of the student feedback, the faculty assessments, and we put all of that together in a report, and then we conduct a hot wash. So as a team, we get to sit down and explore all of the data. So it's qualitative and quantitative data that we use and look at to see how we're measuring and meeting those goals. From that hot wash and that meeting, we actually then look to see for the next course, what do we need to do to improve or continually make it better? And so it's just an ongoing evaluation and assessment so that we can continually improve our courses. And then we also do in-house training for faculty on how to facilitate such tough topics. So that's kind of an overview of kind of what we do is trying to keep it student-centered. We know it's tough sometimes, but we want it to be active and engaged and challenge the students' thought process. And so we try to keep it at a higher level. And so Chaplain Dixon, I'll turn it back over to you.
Chaplain Dixon, there you go. Your son.
Sorry about that. So one of the things that as a chaplain corps that we wanted to do was start with our very basic level, which I mentioned earlier, to make sure that students had an opportunity to understand what it looks like to work in a capacity where you are dealing with people who don't look like you, who possibly don't think like you. And so chaplains kind of struggled in some ways with that, as some of them had church hurt. If you're familiar with that terminology, where they had experiences that weren't so pleasant, and they felt like that some of who they are was being taken away. Some of the students felt like, for example, that white male conservatives were losing their voice in terms of what some of the material presented. Instead of seeing it as an opportunity to get to know them, they felt that they were losing some of their identity. So we needed to make sure that we didn't lose any of our students, and that we were able to work with our students to show that every person brings value to the table, regardless of who you are or what your ethnicity is or what your background is. And so some of the ways that we did that was by sharing experiences. And not only did we share some of our experiences as chaplain corps members of the faculty, but we also allow students to share some of their experiences in terms of how they interacted with each other, with their congregations, other races, etc. One of the good things about Arbinger that works in conjunction with that experience is that Arbinger allows us to demonstrate or lay out a platform where people see people as people, see others in their humanity, to make sure that everybody understands that they have a very important role to play. And so if we demonstrate outward mindset where we see people as people, see them in their humanity, understand that the stereotypes or the information that we were given or socialized to believe or conditioned to believe could be false in some capacity if we saw people other than people. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Chaplain Harris, to add to that or to demonstrate some of the other learning curves that we've experienced in the Chaplain Corps College.
Sure, thanks, Chaplain Dixon. As we're thinking about the tiered approach, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the basic level. So for those unfamiliar with the way the military chaplain corps works, when a professional clergy person is brought into the military to become a chaplain, some cases they have prior military experience, in many cases they don't. And so a lot of what we teach at our 4-week-long basic chaplain courses is a lot of introductory material to not only what chaplaincy is versus professional the work of a clergy person in a civilian capacity, but it's a lot about military culture as well. But even beyond, above and beyond that, when our students come back in at the middle of their career, when they're taking on supervisory responsibilities for the first time, we need to teach them, what does it look like to lead other chaplains who may look or believe or profess very differently than you? And how do you provide for them equitable opportunities for success and advancement and deliberate development? So then we begin to integrate DEI concepts into management and talent development. As our students come back later in their careers, when they're more senior, lieutenant colonels and colonels, senior master sergeants and chief master sergeants, we start to look at how do they contribute to the systems at an Air Force level that we need to make equitable and inclusive. And so they have content that's tailored specifically for leaders, more at like an executive level. Think of in the private sector, like your C-suite executives, that kind of level of leadership. That's what we're challenging our chaplain corps leaders to think through in terms of DEI issues. And so it's really fascinating to trace this tiered approach across a chaplain's career to see the ways in which they'll be challenged to think about DEI issues in a way that's consistent with their scope of responsibility. At the basic level, in a lot of ways, it's responsible for their own biases and their own worldview. But then as they make their way up the ranks and become responsible for other people's careers and for systems that select various people for competitive assignments and whatnot, how are they then responsible to create equity and inclusion in those kind of systems? So it's fascinating to see. Up to this point, we've offered this curriculum in 2 of those 4 phases, and then we look forward to offering it in the last 2 phases in January and February of next year. Still very much in a phase of data collection, that evaluation piece that Dr. Nicholas was talking about earlier. But initial feedback from our students has been very positive. Some of them go through the productive struggle, and we're okay with that, for them to be challenged by some concepts that maybe they haven't been exposed to in the churches from which they came. As I sort of wrap up and put a conclusion on our portion of the presentation, we really look forward to dialoguing with you, Nancy, and with our viewers. But I would just want to say 2 things about DEI as I think about it. One is that diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, these are readiness issues. That's military language, but it's a readiness issue. And I know we're being hosted by the Soul Repair Center, and moral injury is a key component of the identity of your organization. And we believe that these two issues are related. And I'm curious to continue to explore and research on my own the intersections between DEI and moral injury issues, because as we talk about it here at the Chaplain Corps College, it comes back to belonging. And the military is a culture where, at least on the outside, it promises a high degree of belonging, to be a member of a unit, to experience the esprit de corps is what we call it, that sense of a common purpose, a common mission, even if it's very difficult, and the way that that forges relationships. But when you have a person who does not feel like they belong, the sense of betrayal cuts deep. And those are wounds that can compromise the readiness of an individual, certainly, and then the readiness of a unit, of an organization. So as we're thinking about this from a Chaplain Corps perspective, we're first of all trying to address the issues in our own house, as well as seeing ourselves as a change agent to be able to export some of these concepts to our units, to use it as a care, the vocabulary of pastoral care, to help our airmen and guardians and their families, because we understand that in the military, because the stakes are so high, that where you have DEI issues, violations, the chance for moral injury is very high. And so those two things are tethered together in our thinking. And then lastly, for us in the military, I think it's fair to say, and this is based on a lot of messaging by our senior leaders, from Secretary of Defense to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the way down the ranks. DEI issues are strategic issues. And what we mean by that, by the word strategic, is like the world stage. Because as we're trying to be a country that's promoting a free and open society, especially in light of other countries that don't believe in free and open societies, the better we can explore and unearth DEI issues to create cultures of dignity and respect. That's a strategic messaging tool for us against our adversaries, for lack of a better term. So DEI issues are strategic issues. The better we can do that, the better we can message the values that we hold dear: free and open society. And so that's very important to us in the military and in the Chaplain Corps, certainly here at the Chaplain Corps College, and using our Chaplain Corps members as change agents, at the tactical level, the operational level, and the strategic level, all the levels of the Air Force, trying to be equipped and poised to have these conversations and be the change that we want to see. So with that, Nancy, I'll turn the floor back over to you if you have any particular questions or comments you'd like to make.
That'd be great, and maybe Sam, you could also bring in Chaplains Dixon and Dr. Nicholas. I really appreciate this and the chance now to join you in this conversation. I appreciate the introduction of the material very much. And there's a couple of factual questions that have come in, have to do with, do you know if any of the other chaplain branches, chaplain services, are offering this attention to forms of difference that can complicate the experiences of folks in the service?
I can try to speak to that a little bit. Dr. Nicholas, if you have any additional insight, please let me know, and Chaplain Dixon as well. I mean, I do know the thing that unites the various services is we all belong to the Department of Defense, and our Secretary of Defense has made it clear that DEI issues are of critical importance to the readiness of the force. So all the services have been challenged in similar ways by their leadership to address these issues within our ranks.
Mm-hmm.
But the degree to which that has happened, I can't really say, not being in the Army, Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps, Space Force. And I'm equally ignorant of what our partners are doing, like in the Army Chaplain Corps College and the Navy Chaplain Corps College. This has been an initiative that has developed internally to the Chaplain Corps College at the direction of our Air Force Chaplain Corps leadership. So I can't really answer that with a whole lot of certainty, just because we are a little siloed in the way that we do business, according to our service cultures and whatnot. So I can't really speak to what the Army and Navy Chaplain Corps colleges are doing respectively.
Well, if we have others if we have persons who are watching this from other services, feel free to enter into the chat to a response. The other question was CPE, and I don't believe this is addressed, or it could be variously addressed in CPE depending on the location, I imagine. Let me just see if Chaplain Dixon or Dr. Nicholas wants to add any other sort of concluding comments or maybe elaborate on what Chaplain Harris has said before we have a four-way conversation.
Sure. Part of our research was to go out and see what was actually in the, the printed world. And so there are DODI references, there are Air Force instructions and guidance and policy that direct this type of, I'll just call it training and education, be conducted, but it doesn't specify who at what levels. And so, part of what we get in the Air Force every year is an annual local training on, things like sexual assault and suicide prevention that kind of touch on things that we're looking at as far as diversity, equity, inclusion, kind of how they link together. So part of our research when building the curriculum was first to see what our chief of chaplains asked us to go do. Then we look at all of our printed references and guidance and see how we're meeting that. And then through the regular analysis, we just look and see where the students are in their career and try to meet them where they are. And so part of building the course and the design was to try to put all that in the, in the big mixer and then come out with the best results that we could get and then measure it. And so that's another place where we get all of our guidance and references from.
Chaplain Dixon?
So I think the Arbinger inclusion training really speaks to some of this because it allows us to consider another's experience where we are specifically looking at ourselves to see what about my experience is different from another person's. What part of this experience allows me to empathize with another person's experience? Am I understanding another person's experience? And so I think the tools that are in place to do that are going to be helpful down the road. I can say, just to piggyback on other services, during the training, the Arbinger training, there were other personnel from like the Navy that were there in the Army, how they use it across the spectrum of their organizations. I'm not sure, but I do know that they were included in the training. So I'm pretty sure at some point or another that we'll see more from other branches in regards to this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am looking at the chat, but I also have my own questions, and I'm wondering if you could comment, since you've been doing this, how long have you been actually engaged in these courses so far?
We rolled out our first module in this particular training in September. Now that was at our most senior level. So think of like executive level seminar of senior leaders where Chaplain Dixon and Dr. Nicholas taught through concepts of, talent management and creating systems of equity and inclusion. So that was the very first time we ever offered the content at our senior most level. And then in November, early November, we offered it at the intermediate level to about 25 chaplains, an all day long seminar for them as first-time supervisors in looking at mid-level management kinds of issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how to care for employees, for lack of a better term, who come from a host of different backgrounds and experiences. So those are the two pieces of the curriculum we've offered thus far. And then when we come back from the holiday break, we will have our basic chaplain course here. And then we will hold our first offering at the basic level and talk about issues of belonging, which is the foundational piece. And then the fourth and final offering will happen in February, where that'll be sort of our advanced level to what would be the senior most leaders in the chaplain corps at any given installation across the Air Force. So it's a tiered approach, but the way it's rolled out because of our course schedule, we didn't start at the most basic level and go up from there. Just that's how our calendar worked itself out.
One of the questions that has come up is what are some of the ways in which folks are responding, the students in these different courses that you've taught at different levels, to your discussion about sexism or racism, for example? What are the challenges that you're discovering in the classroom when you raise an issue like this?
I'll go with that. So I guess I've been the only one in the classroom in some capacity with this. So some of the challenges are not unusual per se. We have students who shy away from the information, as I mentioned earlier, because they feel like they're being excluded in some way. Then we have other students who feel like the work that we're doing is performative, so they don't feel like we're doing enough. The bottom line is that it is a student-centered approach, and we want to make sure that we can meet every student's needs. We recognize, and Chaplain Harris and Dr. Nick will speak to this as well. We recognize that we're not going to make every student happy, but we do want to give them something to think about in terms of how they will react and respond in the field when it comes to taking care of all people. And I think we do a pretty good job of doing that. So, for example, some of the responses that we've gotten are specific to people feeling excluded. We've had some students to talk about the things that we missed in terms of what we're offering. Maybe they felt like we catered towards one group more than others, or maybe one religion more than others. And so we had to be very deliberate about thinking of, across the spectrum about from the most conservative backgrounds to the least conservative backgrounds. And so to try to meet students where they are in that capacity as well.
Dr. Nicholas, can you unmute so we can hear you?
My
Thanks.
apologies. Sorry.
Okay.
One of the things I noticed in one of our classes was the students might be a little bit nervous given the topic. And so to create a safe environment, we let them know that it's, in the academic terms, we call it academic freedom and non-attribution. And then we also tell them we're not recording anything. And so, that way it tries to, we want them to be able to talk about tough issues, but also this material is very effective. It really gets to the value level of a lot of people. And as Chaplain Dixon mentioned, once we get that discussion going, it really can take off. And so that's been one of the challenges, is to let them know, yeah, it's a tough topic. It's sensitive, but we said we're not going to talk politics. We're not going to get into that world. We're going to talk about seeing people as people in their humanity. And then talking about what they bring to the table. And then, as Chaplain Harris mentioned before, we bring it into team building and management and leadership. And so One of the things we like to say we're doing at the college is making this part of the DNA of the career field. We don't want it to be a program or another project. We want it to be a natural thing for all of our students and all the chaplains and religious affairs airmen, that using critical thinking and emotional intelligence, it doesn't come across as something negative, but as something positive. And so that's kind of one of our goals, is to get that environment in a discussion way, that they walk out different, but they walk out, willing to be able to explore the tough things and know how to deal with it.
Yeah, Nancy, if I could add on, I'll just
Please.
sort of maybe try to paint a picture of how this works, because we try to think about DEI issues the same way we would think about like a concept like leadership. Yeah, I could have a lesson in a curriculum on leadership, but I should never assume that if I've taught you a 50-minute block on leadership, that's all there is to know. In fact, leadership is the heartbeat. It's the DNA of much of what we're asking our chaplains to do as spiritual leaders. So we see DEI issues in much the same light. And I'll illustrate this through one facet of our supervisory course. It's called the Deputy Wing Chaplain course. And this is our course for first-time supervisor chaplains who are 8 to 10 years into their career. So in the context of this practicum, the students are given a scenario. And in the context of this practicum, it's actually, we use augmented reality avatars for simulating difficult supervisory situations that you might find yourself in, where you have to give another chaplain some critical feedback or something like that. So the scenario is that the student is presented with one of the chaplains that they supervise, John Smith, let's call him. John Smith is new to the Air Force. He's a new Air Force chaplain and just got orders that he's going to go spend a year in Korea on what we call a remote assignment. It means he cannot take his family. So the chaplain who's in the seat as John Smith's fictional supervisor is told John Smith's spouse is super stressed out with their spouse getting ready to go to Korea for a year. It's understandable. This young family has just adopted a little baby girl. And so Chaplain John Smith's spouse has come to you as their spouse's supervisor for help about what kind of resources are available for families on the base, and are there childcare opportunities and support groups and those kind of things. So we will paint the picture of this scenario. And then when the augmented reality avatar pops up of the spouse that's come to meet with you as the supervisor of Chaplain John Smith, the avatar on the other side of the screen is a male. So what this begins to do is that you can watch it happen almost in their eyes. They're putting 2 and 2 together that, okay, Chaplain John Smith is the chaplain I supervise, and their spouse is on the other, their simulated spouse is on the other side of the screen, and it's a male. And so if you have a chaplain who comes from a background that doesn't recognize same-sex couples, it's putting them through their own kind of struggle of, okay, what is my role here? Am I a pastoral caregiver? Am I a supervisor? And to watch the students struggle with that dynamic in a controlled environment, a simulated environment, to watch them either do it well or not so well, and then provide them with feedback on that as soon as the scenario is over, can be a learning environment that really is it's hard to duplicate that in many other ways. And I've seen chaplains step away and realize that they were on the wrong wavelength. They were thinking about this situation in the wrong way. They had failed to extend dignity and respect to the spouse of a service member. So bottom line, we weave in these DEI concepts, not just into these blocks, but in so many other facets of our curriculum. We see it, as Dr. Nick said, part of sort of the DNA of trying to teach our chaplains and religious affairs airmen on the enlisted side how to be more intentional about dignity and respect, and to identify blind spots. So I just wanted to paint that picture because I think it's just such a fascinating foray into the way that we try to do DEI across our curriculum.
Mm-hmm. That's a really helpful illustration. I'm sure there'll be some other questions about that. One of the questions in the chat, I think, has to do with what sources I don't know to what extent the Arbinger material identify the sources from which they're drawing, but our listeners are interested in what sources are you referencing related to these forms of marginalization, like racism, systemic racism, or gender identity, or gender itself, or LGBTQIA. Can you mention some of the references that the Arbinger material includes, and perhaps you've added some of your own?
I'll step in on that one. Arbinger, they put together their material based on their own research, but also from feedback when they go out and they work with Fortune 500 companies, and they look at cases and situations that happen in the real world, and they develop it from there. They pull their experts together, and then they develop their material. So for example, in their outward mindset, one of the speakers that they use, he was actually a SWAT team captain and was used as part of the material. He is now on their staff as a presenter. So they develop it out of real life situations, and then just continually evolve from there. And I know I'll mention it, the turn over to Chaplain Dixon, but she also has the glossary of terms. And so Chaplain Dixon, if you don't mind talking about that one, that has been very helpful for us to put a baseline on a lot of things.
That would be great.
Thank you, Dr. Nick. Some of the glossary of terms we pull from, of course, universities like Cornell. We pull from universities such as Howard, because we want to have a variety of diversity, equity, and inclusion glossary of terms that we can provide to students.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I was fortunate to be able to do was to take a certification training at the University of South Florida, where they have over 100 terms in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In my research, I like to make sure that I include specific things when I'm teaching a class or becoming familiar with it, so that we can provide the best to the students. So we use the Winters Group, which is a organization that specifically focus on DEI efforts across corporations and religious institutions. Another resource that is used is the Diversity Gap, which specifically talks about a variety of different things. Another one is a podcast that CNN produces that allows you to look at certain dynamics such as intergenerational trauma, so that you're able to capitalize and talk to all students at once. So we don't have any set resources that we use outside of Arbinger, but it is wise for us to do our own research and come up with other tools that we can use. We use products, magazines or resources like The Economist or The Daily Brief, which has a variety of information in there when it comes to certain details that would be important for chaplains to know as we engage people in the field that we're privileged to serve. So it's just, those are some of the things that we've used at this point. Nothing specific. We don't limit ourselves, but we do try to make sure that we are using the most credible information, and that we're not tapping into something that has an objective or an agenda that wouldn't allow us to reach the widest variety of people.
Yeah, for us, I was just going to add that a lot of times strategic policy is helpful too. If there's a statement from the Secretary of Defense or the President of the United States, and we can foot stomp that of what our leaders are saying, Air Force instructions, that's a pretty level playing field, and it's authoritative to our audience. There's no arguing with that. So it creates a common ground that we all can work from. And then we also, our mission partners at the Equal Justice Initiative, the Legacy Museum, the Rosa Parks Museum, Brian Stevenson, and the work he's done here in the community at Montgomery. We try to take our students to those immersive experiences, and they're curated and backed by various sources. So.
That's really helpful. I wonder if you could, that might be a place to start. So you're taking a racially diverse and gender diverse, at least, and possibly sexuality diverse group to that setting. What is the feedback afterward? Are they talking with each other and you? Do you get, are you able to discern the feedback among those who have experienced a sense of marginalization related to one or more of those forms of difference? Can you assess how those experiences are affecting both those who have what one might call privilege in a setting and those who experience themselves on the edges?
Chaplain Dixon, I think you're probably best suited to answer this question as a course director for the basic chaplain course, which she led several such offsites. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you for that, Chaplain Harris. So this is a tricky one because a lot of the detail the Air Force hasn't specifically defined. So it's hard to title it in that way. However, I'll say from Chaplain Dixon's perspective, as I engaged the students and listened to the comments that they shared with me and that they shared in the feedback, some of the students struggled with believing that data-rich artifacts, I think I mentioned that before, was true. So they felt that information was made up. Some of the students challenged that thinking. Because it is a student-centered environment, we do allow other students to speak their experiences to that. So some of the students challenged that. For example, one specific student looked at the artifacts that are displayed in the Equal Justice Museum and said that the people that I saw in those pictures could very easily be my parents. And he talked about his experience as a person who came from a family who was slave owners. And he talked about how that made him feel. And though he's not directly, wasn't directly involved in that, he has to take the initiative to understand how that may affect other people. And so that's kind of how we bring in Arbinger, where we're able to say, how do we consider another person's experiences? So things of that nature. One of the experiences that we had one of the individuals who was a affiliate with EJI, was a civil rights leader in the community who happens to be a Catholic priest in the Montgomery community. And he talked a lot about the responsibility of clergy persons to speak truth to power. Some of the students struggled with that. They thought his comments were racist because he specifically talked about the responsibility of white clergy individuals when it comes to providing a voice to that. So they struggled with some of the things that he had to say as well. Some of the students felt disconnected because they felt like we only focused on African-American dynamics as opposed to other things that we could have focused on, which is not untrue. And the hope is, as we move forward, that we will make our offsite experiences reflect our chaplain corps, right? Or whether it is African-American experiences or Jewish experiences or Muslim or what have you, and find ways to tap into the community artifacts that can speak specifically to that. So the conversation is not just one-sided, but reaches a variety of people, because when you think about biases, or when you think about limitations in terms of how we look as a people, it should affect all people, but it is an individual's ability to see how am I, what's my script? What have I been conditioned or socialized to believe? And what parts of this could use, some a different perspective or some reflection or so forth. And so those are the kind of things that we've noticed along the way, and some of the things that we want to make sure that we are more deliberate about including in the future.
Right. So part of what you're describing are those intersections of difference that have historically been part of the military population, whether that's religious or gender or race or sexuality. For example, well, sexuality has not historically, but more recently been part of it, or at least not acknowledged historically. So in a way, you're entering into this in one of the most diversified contexts in the country, but that diversity is only newly being recognized as an important aspect of chaplaincy education. Would that be a fair summary at this point, in what I've just said?
I know for us, we're definitely putting an emphasis on it that I don't think we've given it historically, at least in the Air Force Chaplain College.
No. Well, I don't think anybody has, but part of much earlier, Chaplain Harris, you talked about moral injury and the experiences of exclusion for any of these various reasons, whether others that are in a majority position relative to any of those differences would think of it that way or not. And certainly here at the Soul Repair Center, we've had conversations with persons, whether it's their religious identity or their sexuality or their race, who I would use the term receptive moral injury of experiencing exclusion by someone whom they have to imagine would defend them in an event of danger, and they need to, and that it's a mutual obligation. So I certainly affirm that moral injury is very much at stake in what you're addressing. Let me just see if there's something you want to elaborate on that, because I have some other questions from folks to pose to you. Anything about that? Okay. One of the questions that was asked is, are you going to standardize this series of courses? You're still rolling it out at this point, but are you anticipating that this is going to be ongoing and it'll be a process of refining and further identifying the kinds of resources that you, Chaplain Dixon, were naming as pulling them in as a skilled teacher that you are to augment what you basically get from Arbinger? Is that part of your plan?
Yes, the beauty of Arbinger is that it's ever evolving, and they produce new trainings on a regular basis that we'll be able to utilize and access for our student environment. So it will be, I don't know so much as standardized, because we won't use the same material over and over, but we will use Arbinger as it develops more DEI concepts or outward inclusion concepts across the board. So I can't speak for the college, but Chaplain Harris, I'm assuming that it'll be something that will be implemented in the future.
Right. I know it's certainly an area of emphasis here. I think we feel pretty good about the initial approach of the force tiers, as Dr. Nicholas called them. We're just trying to figure out like how to right size the amount of time we devote. So, for example, our first effort at offering it to our senior most chaplains and religious affairs airmen, we earmarked 2 hours, but we were told they wanted more time.
Yeah.
They wanted, it's only a 3-day course, so every moment is precious because these senior leaders, and there was so many other things to cover, but they told us that they wanted more of a discussion on this. So we're going to need to look at, okay, well, if we add an hour, we have to take an hour out somewhere else in the curriculum. And the same goes for our other courses. So we're in the process of taking the student feedback and then processing it according to our ISD process with our staff and figuring out how to right size this initial effort. We're also looking to have additional faculty member trained. So we have Chaplain Dixon, who's an officer. We have Dr. Nicholas, who's a civilian. We also want to have one of our enlisted non-commissioned officers trained. And the one we've identified is a male. So we'll bring a male perspective, an enlisted perspective, just a more of a diversity of voices, because another dynamic in the military community is diversity of ranks. And the way that impacts our relationships to each other, enlisted versus officer, and so on and so forth. So that's another next step. And as I said earlier, we're not treating DEI like a compartmentalized part of our curriculum. It is part of the DNA. So then how can we bake in? Is that a good metaphor? How can we bake in these concepts into other facets of our curriculum, whether it's about resource management, like as a chaplain team, a senior chaplain team is managing the resources given to various faith groups, congregations that meet in their chapel. How do they think about equity issues? Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Wiccan. Are they thinking about those things as they do resource management? So how do we bake in DEI concepts into everything that we teach to try to have that be the rising tide that lifts all boats toward dignity and respect? So.
Yes, once you start identifying those differences of advantage, if you will, that the culture provide, that is there, and one is born into it, then it's a wide range to speak one way about it. One of the questions that we have from an observer has to do with colonialism as the source of a number of these forms of marginalization or difference that can create exclusion or less opportunity. And I'm interested if that has come up at all, either in your presentations or in your students' responses. Kind of, in a way, the origin, if you will, for example, of race and racism.
I personally haven't come across that.
We do talk a lot. I'm looking at the question itself in the chat. We do talk a lot about external advisement, as that's one of the core capabilities of the Chaplain Corps. But as Dr. Nicholas mentioned, to my knowledge, we've not had a conversation about post-colonialism per se, and how that relates to external advisement of the command and staff.
Why don't you say a little bit more about external advisement? What you mean by that?
Sure. So chaplains in the military context, chaplains are one key staff officer of commanders and command teams and senior leaders. Other examples of an advisor would be the judge advocate, the lawyer, the medical officer, the first sergeant. There are various people in the military culture who serve as advisors to commanders. The Chaplain Corps, our primary lane is in religion, spirituality, morality, morale, and ethics. So those are the key things that we are advising commanders on. And at times, if required, speaking truth to power, trying to bring in the ethical dimension, the human domain, where perhaps that's being undervalued or overlooked. So that is that is blocking and tackling for the Chaplain Corps in the Air Force. And I think it's true of all the services that we advise commanders. It's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So that looks a lot of different ways. It could be behind closed doors. It could be in a staff meeting. It could be through emails and memos. It could be in the context of a religious accommodation process. There's a lot of different ways we can advise commander on a host of different topics, but I'm just not familiar with any of our students or our faculty haven't had conversations about how that relates to the post-colonial aspect of racism and race.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that it would be helpful if you all could talk a bit about you said, for example, that your command, as a civilian, I might blur important distinctions, but in a command classroom, command level, that there was an eagerness for more information. So I'm interested in how you're going back to them. How are you staying in touch with what they are encouraging for both depth and breadth of this curriculum?
So the context for that instruction and those comments from our students, that was called our senior chaplain course and our religious affairs strategic leader course. So that's our senior most class for chaplains and religious affairs airmen. So officer and enlisted, generally speaking, lieutenant colonels, senior master sergeants, and chief master sergeants. So these are the top of the pyramid, so to speak. The good news is that the two instructors for that block are with us, and so
not you apparently.
And it was not me. They are the experts on this. So I'll turn it over to Chaplain Dixon and Dr. Nicholas.
Dr. Nick, I'll let you get started.
Thanks. So one of the ways that we mentioned before, is our surveys. And so we do post-grad surveys. After they graduated a course and been out in the field for 6 months, we send them a short survey and ask, how well they've been able to use the material. That's one way. Another way is just physically reaching out to them and just asking them with a phone call or email. You went through it and you made some notes about you want to do more. What types of things would you like to see more or hear more of? And so those are some things. And then the third way was they just came up to us right at the end of the class and just spoke to us personally and said, comments like best on this topic they've ever had in their career, or they want more. And then they would just offer, on some of the areas they'd like to have more discussion time with, either in their student groups or hear a little bit more about certain aspects of the topic. Mm-hmm. And so we make notes of that, and that's what we bring back to our hot washes, if you will. So any and all ways of information gathering and feedback are more than welcome.
Well, let me then respond to that, because you're talking about a command level sharing that feedback, and the prior question had to do with advisement of command. Mm-hmm. So if you noticed in your classes an issue that was recurring, related to some form of an experience of hierarchy, if you will, of being marginalized. Can you imagine, if you've had this kind of feedback from command, if you began to discern this as a theme or a broader concern than an individual's, does it sound to you as if they would want to hear from you? The command structure,
Could you clarify? Sorry.
If in your instruction, not with the command officers, but with another level, you began to discern a recurring issue, it might be around racism, an experience of it, or several voices saying this was an issue for them on the base. I think one of the questions that was coming to us is there some point at which you, with this response from the command, would feel you could say, we are discerning that there is an issue for us. Do you think you'd have a reception for that?
So just Nancy, to make sure I understand your question, are you saying if a chaplain in the course of their ministry learned about the culture and climate in an organization, that there were like a racist culture,
Yes.
that they would, do we provide instruction on how they might advise on that to
Yes,
their
or as you teach and you discern that there's recurring evidence of an issue, would you yourselves, since you had this response from the command structure, but certainly if from this course, would you hope that a chaplain would one of the markers of effectiveness of your course be that a chaplain would be able to discern this is not a one-off, this is
Absolutely.
a theme?
Yeah, Chaplain Dixon, correct me if you think I'm off base here, but I mean, absolutely, this is one of the things that is it's one of the most frightening aspects of our job, when we have to give a leader bad news, especially if we sense that they may not want to hear it. If we're discerning in an organization that there are things going on, maybe it's driven by command, and maybe it isn't, but that can be one of the most harrowing days for especially a young chaplain, if they're not comfortable in their own skin in the military, to, as a captain or a major, go before a lieutenant colonel or a colonel and say, "Sir, ma'am, do you have a minute?" and then sit down and share that. That is not easy.
No, it's not.
Chaplain Dixon, if you have any experiences, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think that one of the things, and I'll go back to Arbinger because I just think the tool is so useful, but it provides a space for us to kind of have those kind of conversations. For example, it has a workshop that talks about equity assessment. So it allows us to kind of bring up certain information or certain things that we may have heard in the field or something, and just use as a hypothetical, not necessarily assigning it to an individual or an organization, but as a hypothetical. They have a workshop that talks about who to include, where you're looking across the organization at various levels in terms of rank or officership or enlisted. They also have a feedback assessment where you're able to engage senior leaders about how are you giving feedback, how are you making your members feel like they belong, or encouraging them or motivating them to do the work. And so the beauty of it is that it's so broad that it kind of touches on all of those things. So you never have to really single out an organization or an individual, but you can provide hypotheticals throughout the training that allows you to kind of assess different information. And my thought is that the leaders will listen to that. It's like, oh, this seems to be a theme, or
Right.
seems to be recurring. So there is a platform to do that.
That's really helpful. And it seems to me that that's part of leadership responsibility. If you and part of what your training would do would be to heighten persons' capacities to hear that and recognize it as an important experience of exclusion, a pattern of an experience of exclusion, for example. One of the questions that our audience has asked also is, in your teaching, is there an opportunity if a person who's in the classroom is particularly affected by, say, a classroom session, or has some other response to this that they'd like to speak with one of you all, but not in front of everybody? Are there opportunities for conversation with students in the instructional pattern that you have now?
Yeah, I'll take that one. We also preface not just the DE&I work, but anything that's sensitive, like postvention or suicide, or anything that we think a student might have been affected or could be. We always offer the disclaimer before we get started in those sessions that this could be a very sensitive topic to some, and it's perfectly okay if you need to talk to one of the chaplains here, one of the staff, I mean, so we always provide that safe environment. And sometimes, you know, like I mentioned before, some of the material is pretty affective. And some of my classes, not here at the college, but in my prior teaching, we have had students that, you know, needed to talk to somebody. And so we set them up. So we always provide that environment and put that disclaimer that it's okay.
And also for most of our courses, we have seminar groups. So it's much smaller groups that students find it easier to talk in the smaller settings as opposed to the classroom as a whole or the larger setting. And so we've had very rich conversations in the smaller capacities as well that students might not feel as comfortable mentioning out loud or mentioning in the large group that they've shared in the small group. And so we also allow students to, well, for my seminar group, because every seminar group leader does it differently, but I often put the disclaimer out there, what's shared in this seminar group stays in this seminar group, so students can feel like they have a safe space.
Mm-hmm. It's really helpful. When you finish a class or a course, so to speak, and it sounds like they range in length. What are some of the formats? I mean, that's probably not the right word. How long is a class typically?
Our shortest class is 3 days long. We have a couple of those of the 10 courses we offer. A couple of them are 3 days long. Several of them are 1 week. A couple of them are 2 weeks. Our longest course is the basic chaplain course. It's 4 weeks long. And again, that's their introduction to military chaplaincy, at least Air Force chaplaincy. That's a 4-week long course.
The lessons range from 1 hour to 2 hour or whatever we feel is necessary or needed to do certain specific dynamics within the lesson block. For example, if we have a practicum that we want to assess students with, the first hour may be more informational or specific to resources and literature, and the second hour may be hands-on, because we try to make it very hands-on friendly for the students as well.
Do you have some sense now of the kinds of questions or revisions that, you know, often when someone teaches a course for the first time, part of that experience is, okay, what am I going to do differently next time? Are you beginning to have those kinds of conversations with one another, especially Chaplain Dixon and Dr. Nicholas? I think you're the primary teachers, if I understand correctly. Are you able to have those kinds of conversations with each other and begin to think, or I want to go talk with Arbinger about this, or what are you seeing in your classes, that kind of consultation?
We, Chaplain Dixon and I immediately sit down as soon as the classes are done and we've got all the data and everything. We sit down and just have a conversation between us two, how we thought it went, what we can do different, you know, kind of like a plus delta. What went well, what didn't go so well, what are we going to work on next time? And then, you know, she'll, as the course director, I don't want to speak for her, but she puts all the data together in a report. So Chaplain Dixon, if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so the uniqueness of the reports that we do, or the end of course surveys, is that we're able to look for specific themes from students to see what did they resonate with, what was more problematic, you know, what could we tweak or change or take away or add to. And so the students do a really good job for the most part of giving us constructive criticism, which is healthy, right? It allows us to put our best foot forward. And so we look at that a lot, but we also pay attention to some of the things that we observe as course directors or SMEs in the classroom to see what types of things we could do differently. For example, from the DEI perspective, one of the things that we recognize right away with students struggling with certain language or something to that effect, because the panelists would mention certain things based on their experiences, we knew we needed to add a glossary of terms so that the students could familiarize themselves with how certain groups of people look at certain information. And so it's kind of, it evolves. And with every course, we learn something new or learn something different about not only the students, but ourselves as well.
Mhm.
And some of the experiences that we've had in the field, how helpful they would be to students to share those experiences. So it evolves with every
Mhm.
lesson.
Mhm.
I'll add to that too. There was, and Chaplain Harris remembers this when we had one class where part of the material, one or two of the students had a tough time processing that information, and they really got stuck. And so we helped them through it, but it was a point of learning for us to, one, know that that's possible. Other students are going to struggle with it, but also how we can help them process it a little bit better, so that we can continue on. Because, you know, as an educator, if a student gets stuck somewhere, it's going to be hard for them to move on the rest of the material. So
Right.
it helps us in our discussions. Okay, we got a sticky point. Let's figure out how we can help the students process it. But we do learn quickly.
What are your current, and this is a great question, and I want to ask it in the way that it's been posed in the chat. You two are experienced teachers. What are the measures of success for you as you evaluate? You're coming almost, you've got a couple, or at least one more to offer for the first time, if I've heard correctly. Even if I've heard wrong. What I
Two
want,
more.
okay. What are the measures of success that you are discerning for evaluating this first challenging year?
Well, you know, the quantitative data, of course, we use a Likert scale for our lesson by lesson. So, you know, we use that as one measure to get the quantitative data. And then the qualitative data we look for in the comments. And so those are the most common measures.
What do you want to see in those comments that will help you have a sense of, yeah, we got it on that one. We need to work again on that objective, that sort of thing.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So one of the questions that we ask in our survey is, how are you going to apply this material when you go back to your position? And they physically write out how they're actually going to apply and use, you know, what they've learned. And so that's one of the ways that we get direct feedback from the students that we were at least met that part of the objective. And then with our grad surveys, we see if it continued on.
Well, when you say you meet that part of the objective, what do you want to see in the ways they indicate they will use the material?
Part of the ways we've seen indicated before is, one, they're going to take it back, you know, as a leader and have conversations with their team on the topic. Another, they might conduct a seminar at their local base, conduct sessions on their own to spread the material, and then the thoughts and the concepts behind it. So they have a lot of different ways that they say they're going to take it back and use it. Chaplain Dixon, you might have some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so some of the ways that we see it, for example, on the basic course, chaplain course level, is that the students, they go to OTS, which is the officer training school, and then they go to their bases without coming to the schoolhouse or the chaplain court college to learn some of the more functional or job specific dynamics. And so some of the feedback that we get is, well, I didn't know this prior to coming here. So this is good to know, whether it's about the AFI or more specifically about advisement, or more about ASSIST, which is our suicide prevention intervention lesson block that we provide. So hearing them say that this is information I wished I had known prior to going to my installation it's a good measurement for us to know that this is the kind of information we need to keep pouring into students on a regular basis.
Will you all have a chance to consult with each other before you start this cycle again, and tweak or look for additional, just, to think through it together, and ways you want to maybe extend or revise from this first time.
Yeah. Every day is an ongoing cycle of discussion for us. We are back and forth about what works, what doesn't work, what may need some adjustment, what may miss some students based on certain specifics, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And so we're constantly in dialogue about what that looks like across the spectrum. So we have from like January through October, where we have the bulk of our educational the bulk of our education is offered. And then we have this down window, just a small little window, where we're continually talking about that, updating lesson plans, adding, arranging curriculum plans and different things like that. So we're constantly looking at how to best provide for the students' needs.
Well, one of the advantages I see is that two of you are involved in it. So, and then you can also bring in Chaplain Harris. So it's one thing to start a new course that has inherent contextual challenges in it, as you are, by oneself, but to have a colleague, and I know you're also getting data from students, but as experienced teachers, you're also trying to take in what happened here when I used that illustration. And what does this question from students mean? So I'm grateful that you have the three of you and two of you in the classroom. We've come to the end of this, at least this first conversation, and I want to assure you from the chat that there's a lot of appreciation for the ways you're breaking new ground, and urgently needed ways of breaking new ground. So there's certainly appreciation from our audience, and I want to express my appreciation for your careful preparation for this. It's a very important innovation that's clearly been stated in the chat, and I want to thank you for making time and for the preparation you did on top of everything else for this webinar. Great help. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.